wagon. And all his horses were called Nellie, whether it was a boy or girl. They were always called Nellie. The horses that he had were always 1 foot away from the glue factory. And I don't believe any of his horses ever died a natural death. They were always involved in some sort of an accident with my father, an automobile hitting him from the side, from the rear. My father was involved in a lot of accidents. There were a lot of cars around at the time, but my father insisted on driving his horse and wagon. The horse was stabled not too far away from our house, and it was our custom on weekends. My brothers would go down there, and we would have to feed the horse. We'd give him the oats, we'd feed him the hay. We'd make sure that the horse was comfortable. My mother was very reluctant about giving my father money for the horse, to buy oats and so forth. And my father, whenever he approached my mother for money, incidentally, my mother was the keeper of the funds, and my father would approach my mother and say to her, "Chane, I need some money to buy some oats for the horse." And my mother would say, "What, again oats for the horse?" When we had different occasions to go to a wedding, a mitzvah, we used to rent our tuxedos from a tuxedo man whose name was Bernard the Tailor. And we used to rent the tuxedos from him, and instead of returning it the day after the mitzvah or whatever occasion we used them for, we used them for other functions. If there was another function, you took it and you kept it for a week and used to return it to Bernard the Tailor, and he'd always look at these tuxedos and says he doesn't understand how our tuxedos come back in such poor shape. As a matter of fact, one time he commented, he says, "I don't understand, how come there's oats in the pocket?" Of course, we never told him we went to the stable to feed the horses. I meant to tell you this earlier while I was talking about my cousin Hicky. Hicky has, or had a brother, I don't know whether he's alive or he's passed away. His name was Joe Minskey. Incidentally, there was a Joe Minskey, a doctor, Joe Minskey, who looked like a Chinaman, and Hicky's brother, who was also Joe Minskey, but he was referred to by his Jewish name as Yoshke, or Yoshke del Baum. Why did they call him Yoshke del Baum? Well, because Joe used to flit around from here, there. He never settled down. If they had a job to be done, Joey was the first one who said he could do it. If you had a house to paint, Joey would say he's a painter. You had to watch him very carefully, otherwise he'd be painting someone's house if it happened to be next to yours. Or if you had to put up a fence, Joey says he's a carpenter. But Joey would wander off into someone else's land if he was putting up his fence. So you had to be careful what you did when you hired Joey. Very, very unreliable. And you never made the mistake about giving Joey any money before he completed the job, because you never know when he would finish the job. As I said, Joey was married, I don't know how many times he was married. He had children all over the place. He did have one son who was married by his first wife, who unfortunately during the war he was killed flying in a plane over Alaska. Joey, I don't think, ever got over that. I understand he was a very, very fine boy. I loved all sports. Baseball was my favorite. My parents were not sports-minded like the parents that followed them. Anyone who played baseball was considered a bum. Who played baseball? Playing baseball meant that I'd be tearing my shoes. That cost money. And it's one expense my parents didn't need. Well, anyways, throughout my teenage years, I played baseball married, I played baseball. In the service, I played baseball. I played all over Boston. I played in New Hampshire. I played with some very fine semi-pro teams. I played until I was about 35 years of age, and finally I decided to give it up. Let me tell you a story or two about my baseball days, and I've told this story to the children many times. Well, I've told it a few times. One of the teams I played with, I don't recall who it was or where it was, but we had a deaf and dumb ball player who was playing first base. A very, very fine ball player. And of course, they used to converse with him in sign language. Well, anyways, one day we were playing some team, and there was a very close play at first base. It's one of those bang-bang plays. And the umpire called the runner safe. The dummy, as we called him, immediately started jumping up and down, waving his arms at the umpire, and finally the umpire looked at him and he says, "You say one more word, I'm going to kick you out of this game." I also played baseball with an all-Polish team, and it was quite an experience for me to play with the Polish team because I did not understand the signals, and of course all signals were given in Polish. They're a fine bunch of ball players, and I'll never forget one day this Polish team played another Polish team, so that before I got through there were 17 Polish fellows and one Jew playing in this game. And all around the field there were the sisters, the nuns, the priests were there, and the Polish population from the entire city at the game. I was pitching, and of course everything was, they had to cut out the signals in Polish because the other team would pick up the signals. Well, anyway, we started to play the game. As it happened, we beat them. I pitched that game. We beat them it was a very, very tight game, very, very, very good game. And baseball, as I said, has always been my love. I played with Polish teams. I played with Italian teams in East Boston. I played with Catholic teams in Beachmont. I played wherever there was a team who would accept me. I played baseball. It was really one of my first loves. I graduated from high school in 1930, during the height of the Depression. And I wanted to go to school. I wanted to go to college. And of course, money was very, very tight at the time. I got a job in Brookline in a variety store. I think they paid me about $15 a week. I had to travel from Chelsea to Brookline, street job. I used to take my lunch with me, and I'd come home in the evening, perhaps 10, 11 o'clock at night. This variety store was in the heart of Brookline, where the non-Jews lived, and it was referred to, the area was referred to as Whiskey Point. And believe me, you could smell whiskey all over the place. There's so many shikurim, everyone was always drunk. They'd come into the store, which was called the Jews. Her name was Mrs. Mead. But the Goyim never referred to as Mrs. Mead store. They referred to that's the Jews' place, so that's where I worked. I worked there for 1 year. I accumulated perhaps $200-300 so that I would be able to enter my first year in college. Now, my job at Mrs. Mead's was to wait on the trade, and one of the biggest chores that I had was keeping some of these bums. They were actually bums out of the store. It was a hangout for some of these guys, and on many occasions I had to go to the gymnasium where I saw them, and they were challenging me in boxing. They challenged me in different sports. To make a long story short, when I left that place, I had the respect from all the people in the neighborhood. Going to college was tough. I had enough money for perhaps a year. Tuition wasn't very high. First 2 years I was at Boston University, and on many, many occasions I was called out of a classroom, and the dean would ask me, when am I going to pay a tuition? When am I going to pay the money that I owed the school? It would stop and go throughout my college career in trying to raise enough money so that I could complete going to Boston University, and eventually I went to Boston College Law School. And I'll always have a kind spot in my heart for Boston College. They helped me out. The president of the law school got me a job. This was during WPA days, and with the money that I got working at the school, I was able to pay for part of my tuition. My parents helped me as much as they could, and it was not unusual for me to go to school with the lint in my pockets. I'd have 20 cents. I'd use 10 cents car fare from Chelsea to Boston, or rather I would bum a ride from Chelsea to Boston. I'd have enough for coffee and donuts, 10 cents, coffee and donuts. Donut was a nickel, coffee was a nickel. And I had 10 cents to take a streetcar home. It was really tough. My scenario and outline for this tape is based on the stories that I used to tell the children about the time when I was a little boy, and perhaps someday their children will listen to this tape and ask their parents to tell them some of the Geschichtes and Bobameises about the time when they were small children. I didn't mention my wife, your grandmother, while I was taping. I wanted her to tell you some stories. I'm not sure that she will. I've tried to tell you stories about my growing up years. I've tried not to be maudlin or sentimental, and I hope that I have made you laugh at some of these stories. The best years of my life began when I met my wife, your grandmother, your mother. Like her mother and your great-grandparents, you have a heritage that you can really be proud of. There are so many stories, Geschichtes, that I have not included in this tape. And every once in a while, I am asked to tell this story or that story. And recently, Brenda was telling me that she would like to hear the story about the boilers the boiler's the story that my brother Albert Albertson used to tell his children. Of course, you realize we did not have central heating in our home, and the hot water was hooked up to a gas boiler, and we used to heat the water, and from this big boiler, which was approximately 30 inches round and about 5 or 6 feet in height, we would have hot water, and it only contained about 30 or 40 gallons, so you could see that it was constantly in use. Now, after using these boilers for several years, they would develop leaks, and they would have to be discarded. And there was no trash pickup, as I recall. We simply took the boiler, we threw it out in our backyard, and we affectionately referred to as the dump. It was not a dump, but it was a big piece of land that was owned by my parents that we used to use as a playground. We used to play handball there. And we used to make use of these boilers that used to accumulate in the backyard from other neighbors who used to throw the boilers there, so that eventually there was quite a few boilers. And what we used to do is line them up, and we would line up 10, 15, and we would jump over these boilers. And the name of the game is to beat the last guy who jumped over, say, 10 or 15 boilers. You would stop when you finally hurt yourself because you couldn't make the last boiler. And of course, the one who jumped over the most boilers would win the game. I thought it was a story that you'd care to hear, and it was a request from Alan Kaplan that my brother Albert used to tell to his children. I thought it would be worthwhile for me to repeat it. I don't know whether or not this tape will be retained or discarded, but if it's retained, let me make a tribute to my brother Albert, whom we all miss. He epitomized the finest in a man. He was such a good man. He was such a good father. He was such a good brother. Whatever goodness there was in my brother Albert. I don't recall Albert ever being angry at anyone. I don't recall him ever having to say a bad word about anyone. He was loved by all his brothers and sisters. He was loved by all his friends. And we missed him. I'm sure his family missed him, his sons, his wife, his grandchildren will always miss Albert. He was a real mensch.